In this video, we are going to talk about CSS grids. In my previous video, I talked about CSS Flexbox and I mentioned that CSS Flexbox is used for one-dimensional layout mechanism, okay? And CSS grid is used for two-dimensional layouts. So whenever you are kind of dealing with columns and rows, in that situation, you should be using CSS grids, okay? Now, let's have a look at how this works and how you can use in your own projects. So right now on my screen, as you can see, I have one div, and in this div, I have total of 8 divs. And I have given them a class name of grid item, and there is a class A on the first div. Okay, I'll be using this A later on. But right now, as you can see, I have these 8 divs and they have the class names. Okay, so let's get rid of this thing. Now in my CSS, I have selected the grid container and I have this background color height of 400 pixel margin so that I can just bring this box here. And on the grid item, I have given a background color and the color height of 38 pixel and border of 1 pixel. That means each of the div now is 40 pixel. And as you can see, let's go to this. As you can see, each of the div here is 40 pixel in height, okay? And width is automatically determined based on the screen size. So this is the situation we have right now. In order to use grid, you have to first make sure that you are writing this display grid, okay? The moment you do that, notice you have some change here. So there is slight change here and here in the elements here. You have the grid, okay? That means the container that we are working with, this is the main div. It is now a grid container. Now, what does this thing means? Is the container itself grid or there is a grid inside that thing? Okay, so the idea here is you can imagine grids as a kind of, you can say, a layer on top of the container. Okay, and on that layer we create our design. So the grid is inside the container. The container itself is not the grid. Grid is just working as a kind of, you can say, a way to guide our designs. Okay, so it is existing on top of that container. It will become very clear once we start talking about the alignments, and then you will notice that the grid indeed exists on top of that container. Okay, it is just working for us as a guide. Okay, so that is all there is. Now right now by default we have one single column. That's why everything is kind of like showing up in this manner. Okay, and without the grid also we had this single column, but it is something that coming from the natural flow of the document. But right now everything is in this manner. Okay, now let's say I want to have two columns. Now in order to get two columns, you have to simply write a grid template columns, and here you can specify the width of the column. So let's say you want one column of 100 pixel. Okay, and let's say you want another column of 100 pixels. So if you want multiple columns, you simply have to write it this way, and you have to specify the width of each of the columns. Okay, so right now notice here that the first column here is of 100 pixels. So if you go here, notice the width is 100 pixel for the first div, and for the second div also you have 100 pixel, right? So this means this container here is not the grid. The grid is kind of like, as you can see, it is existing on top of that container. It is working as a guide. So this is the idea here. Grid is kind of like just there to help us design our thing. Okay, now here you can specify your width, and you can specify anything, okay, as you like. If you want 3 columns, you can do it in this way. If you want 4, you can do it in this way. Okay, so automatically it will create your columns for you. Now this is column, this is like 1, 2, 3 and 4. These are columns, and this is row 1 and 2, and rows are automatically created. So in the CSS grid you do not have to worry about the row. You can control their sizes, you can even create extra rows, but the idea here is to most of the time you will be adjusting columns, and rows are automatically kind of created by the algorithm that is creating the grid. Okay, so you do not have to worry about the rows. You can control their size, but I think most of the time columns are more than sufficient to help you out. Now, right now, as you can see, we have this 100 pixel, 100 pixel, 100 pixel, right? Instead of writing this way, what we can do, we can write it using a very like we can use this repeat function of CSS, and we can create 3 columns. Okay, so let's say we have 3 columns. We have to specify number of columns we want, and then we have to specify the width of each of the columns. So this is 100 pixel. Okay, so the moment you do this repeat 3 and 100 pixel here, automatically you will have this design here. So we are doing the same thing. Simply we are using the repeat method offered by CSS. Okay. Now here you can pass your width in different manner, you can pass width in percentage or other ways you like. Now let me show you something else. So there is a very simple approach to create designs. So what happens most of the time, we do not have an idea of how much width we want each column to have. We simply let the algorithms choose, let the algorithm decide that, hey, whatever the container width is, I just want you to assign some percentage of that width, so that I can have some alignment on very smaller scales. Okay, so let me show you what that means. So right now, if you look at this main div, so it has the width of 591 pixel, right? So if you can notice here, it is 591 pixel, and height is 400 pixel, right? So what I want to do, I want to simply let the algorithm create, let's say, 2 columns, and I want each column to have equal width on any screen size. So in order to do that, we have a different way of writing the grid template columns, and this is using the fraction unit. And using this, you can use 1FR, and this is 1FR, 1FR. So what you are saying here, hey, I want you to create a grid, and that grid should occupy fractional space, whatever the available space there is of the container, whatever 591 pixel. I want you to use one fraction of that space for the first column and one fraction for the second column. And if you say I want 2 fraction for the second column and 1 fraction for the first column, you are saying, hey, out of 591 pixel, just give me 1 fraction for the first column and 2 fraction to the second column. That means second column is slightly wider as compared to the first column. So this is the idea behind the fractional unit. So this means it's kind of like automatically determines how much space to calculate for each of the column. So let's say you want a third column and you want it to have, let's say, 3FR. So the moment you do that, notice what happens here. The first column width is slightly reduced. The second column is kind of little bit wider than the first one. And the third one is kind of it feels like it's thrice the time of the first one. That means the first one is 1FR, this is 2FR, this is 3FR. That means, but it is not exceeding the width of the div. It is not exceeding 591. That means 1FR, 2FR, or 3FR, they are simply kind of determining the proportion of the space to allocate to each of the columns. So this is the idea here. So if I try to reduce the width of the screen, notice what happens here. So the moment I reduce the width of the screen, it is automatically kind of reducing the uh, width here, and proportionally it is kind of maintaining that 1:2:3 ratio of the width. Okay, so this is the thing that is doing here. Now that we have this thing, we can kind of we can also write it in this way. We can write it repeat. Let's say I want 2 columns of 1FR, and I want the third column to be of 2FR. So you can use it in this way. So this is like a really nice way of doing this. Okay. Now another way of writing this thing is using you can say that, hey, I want 2 columns, but I also want column to have a minimum width of, let's say, 50 pixel. So what you can use, you can use CSS minmax function, and here you can specify the minimum value that you want. So let's say you want the minimum value to be 30 pixel and the maximum value to be 1 FR. Okay, so the moment you do this, what you are saying here, hey, I want two columns. Repeat means you want two columns, and I want each of the column to be 30 pixel minimum, but after that maximum value should be 1 FR. So that means it should not go below that 30 pixel. So here right now what it is doing, it is creating the column, but the width here is not 30 pixels. So width here, as you can see, it is kind of like 255 pixels. So but if you reduce this thing, okay, so if you keep on reducing this thing, notice here how it works. So it is still 67 pixel, right? It is not going to go below that particular value. Okay, so the idea here is to create the width. So you can specify the minimum width. So if let's say your content has some width, you can specify that as well, and you can simply tell the algorithm to not go below this value, stay within this range. And this is what you are saying when you say min max. Okay, now um, similar to that, you have grid template rows. Okay, and here what you can do, let's do one thing. Let's try to go back to a simple approach, 1FR, 1FR. Now here, when you say the grid template rows, that means now you have the ability to do something on this thing, okay, on the rows. So now you are kind of like dealing with this area. Now here what you can do, you can specify the width of the rows. So right now the width, like not width, like height of the rows. So what you can do, you can simply kind of like do the same approach that we did here. You can do it in this way, but the rows are automatically kind of like created for you. So right now we have 1 2 3 4 rows, right? So what we can do, we can determine their width. Okay, so we can kind of like when you write it this way, hey, I want 30 pixel. Okay, so notice what happens here. So the moment you say 30 pixel, let's make it 42 pixel, because the width here is 40 pixel, right? So let's make the row to be 42 pixel. So right now if you go here, it is showing us the content width and height. It is not showing us the rows width and height, but notice here, like there is slight difference here. So you can imagine it like it's 42 pixel. Okay, so this is for the first, this is for the first row. So right now the row here, the first row is here is 50 pixel. Now if you want the row to all the rows to have the same thing, then you can simply use repeat uh, 4 rows and 50 pixel. Each of the rows will have 50 pixel of the height. Okay, so this is the idea here. So in the rows you can have that thing. Okay, and let's say you want to create some extra rows, and let's say you want another row, and that is a 40 pixel. You will get the row, but you will not see that row when you disable this. The moment you disable this, that row exists, but it is not kind of visible to you. Only it is visible when you are using the developer tools, and when you click on the grid, you will able to see that extra rows. But I think most of the time you will be well off without using the rows, and you do not even have to worry about dealing with the rows. Only thing you need to understand, that you can control the height of the rows, and that's something I think is most of the time almost kind of like solved for you. So no need to worry about this thing. Now instead of doing this, what you can do, like there is shortcut for writing these two things, and that is using the grid template. Okay, so the moment you do this, you have grid template here, and the moment you hover over this, notice here what it says. It says you have this grid template rows, and then you have grid template columns. Okay, so the first value is for the rows, and the second value is for the columns. So you can use this shorthand, but stick to the this full name for the time being. No need to go for that shorthand at this moment. Now that we have the basic understanding of how to create columns and rows, let's talk about how to uh, align items. Okay, so there are various things that you have to understand here. First of all, this width that you see here, so when I hover over any item in the DOM, the width that you see here, this width is kind of like the width of the item. It is not the width of this particular box. because that is something it's not possible to visualize in the DOM. Okay, so using this tool, it is not possible to visualize that. But right now, the items are kind of occupying the entire space. That's why the grid width is the box of that grid. The width of that thing is 295.5 pixel. Okay, but note that the grid is only existing on the top of container in order to allow us to make the alignment and adjustments. Okay, so they are just existing as a guide. You can consider it that way. So they are not kind of like something that's part of the content. They're just there so that we can align our things and work with our design. Now the width that you see here, it is the content width. It is not the width of this one single box. Okay, now let me disable this thing so that we can have the entire thing. And let's also kind of like let's try to, let me change the color here. So this green line that you see here, that green line, one single green line, that is one single box, and this entire thing is the grid, and they're existing on top of the container. Okay, and the idea here is to kind of like do some alignment here. Now there are various ways to align our grid. First of all, we have the content inside each of the box in the grid, so we can align the content within the box. Apart from that, we have this grid as a whole, so we can also align the grid in the container itself. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. So first of all, let's do one thing. Let's align all the items inside the grid. Okay, so there are various properties, and you have this thing. So let's use these justify items. Now justify items, whenever you hear the term justify, that simply means you're working in the horizontal direction. And when you hear the term align, that means you're working in the vertical direction. So notice what happens here. If I use this justify items to center, notice the width of the content is reduced. The width of the box stays the same. It is still 1 FR, that means one fraction of that available space. Okay, so one fraction, that means 591 divided by 2. So whatever that thing is, that is the width of the grid, and the content width is different. So the moment you do this justify items, it goes to the center. Okay, by default they are stretched out to fill the entire space, but right now my item width is kind of like reduced. Here I have not specified the grid item width here, that's why it's kind of like assuming the content width. So when you use center, you have this item in the center of this grid in the horizontal direction. And now let's say I want items to be in the center in this vertical direction. Okay, so in that case you can use align items, and here you can use center. So the moment you do that, all the items there, because they have the simple like they're all the part of this grid container, they're all getting in the center of the box. Okay, that means they are getting in this center of each of the grid boxes. Okay, so that means if you look at them, they are kind of like in the center. So notice here how they look on the screen. But let's turn on this grid, and once you have this, there are various ways there are various things. So in the justify items you have end. So the moment you do this end, it will goes to the right side, and you have this start. If you do this, they all go to the this left side. You notice how they are going in this direction. Now similarly, you have this on the align items, you have the start. So that means they will move to the top. Notice how they move to the top. And you have this end. So that means they are going to move to the end. So this is how you can like use justify items and align items in order to do some alignment for each of the thing. Okay, so this is the idea behind the align items and justify items. So by default, notice what happens here. They're automatically kind of like in horizontal direction, they are stretched out. Now there is shorthand for this, and I think it's a good idea to remember this shorthand. So if you hover over this, notice here it says align items, then justify items. Okay, so that means first property is for the vertical direction, second property is for the horizontal direction. So here you can specify that, hey, I want vertically, I want it to be in the center. So if you just enter one value, it's automatically assume that both of them should be in the center. Okay, so it's going to assume that align items, justify items should be in center. But let's say here you want it to be at the start. So if you enter the second value, it is going to assume that it is the value for the justify items. So this is kind of like a shorthand that you can use, and it works out of the box. Okay, so instead of writing this whole thing, you can do that. Similarly, for these two things, as I mentioned, you can use grid template. Now, now that we have talked about the alignment of the item inside that grid, um, now let's talk about the grid itself. So grid in itself is kind of like, one single thing, and it is existing on top of that container. So now how we can align this grid with respect to the container? Now let me show you how this looks like. So let's say I want each of these things to be 100 pixel, right? Now they are of 100 pixel. These things, they are like, these items are columns are of 100 pixels. So right now they are of 100 pixel. Now what I want to do, I want to bring this grid in the center of this thing. Okay. So the moment you bring that thing in the center of that thing, you have this thing called justify content. Okay. So here you can bring them to the center. So entire grid is kind of like in the center of the container now. And now if let's say you want them to be at the end, everything will go to the end. You want them to be at the start, everything will be at the start. Now apart from this, you have something called space around. So space around is like, you have kind of like in the horizontal direction, you have this, in between you have equal space, but around them you have some slight space. So that's kind of like how it works. And if you have this space between, you will see that both of them are kind of like, in between the one single column, they will have equal spaces. So this is the idea here. And apart from this, you have space evenly, and space evenly is kind of like, going to put equal spaces everywhere. So on the left hand side, on the right hand side, you will see equal spaces. So this is something that you can use depending on your requirement. And now apart from this, and notice when I say justify content, this is not applicable on the items inside the grid. It is for the grid itself. Now in the flex box also you have justify content and all these things. Now this, you have this align content, sorry. And this is for the vertical alignment of the grids. The moment you do center, notice how a grid is kind of like, vertically here in the center of this thing. Okay, so if I bring this thing in the center, notice what happens. Notice everything is kind of like collapsed in the middle of this entire container. Okay, so that's why I was telling you that grid itself is not the container. It's kind of like existing on top of the container to help us create our designs. So this is now something that I believe is getting clear. And in the same way, you have like, on this align content, also you have a space evenly, space between, etc. Okay. And shorthand for this is the place content. And here also, like, you can write center. And the moment you do that, just comment this out, you'll have the same thing. Okay. So let's now do space between. Notice what happens, everything everywhere, like, in the column and in the rows, we have equal spaces in between the elements, in between like rows and the columns of the grid. So this is the idea. Now here you can specify second argument as well, so feel free to go ahead and experiment with that thing. Now that we have this alignment part, let's do one thing. Let's bring back to the one a fast card. We can see the everything in one go. Now on the grid items, we have similar properties, and here also you have things like alignment of the specific item. So right now, all my divs, all the child that we have here, like these children are kind of like they have the same class grid item. That means if I like do something on each of the children, they have kind of like, everything will be applied on all of them. So here also you have like, you have this align self, and here you can specify center. The moment you do this, you have this item going in the center of the box. And if you want each of them to have different type of alignment, there then you can like specify different class names, and you can do something accordingly. So let's say instead of doing on this uh, all of them, I just want to do it for the first one. So notice how here, how the first one only goes vertically in the center, right? And if you want, like, justify self, you can do this here, and you can, like, do this in the center. So notice how everything moves there. Let's bring this thing in the center. And here also, like, you can do this. So this is kind of like, something that you have flexibility even on the grid items. And if you want to have a control over how to align them, then you can use this justify self and align self in your own ways. Okay, so this is all there is to this alignment. Here too, you can use the shortcut, and that is place self, and you will get the same result when you do this. Okay, so this is like the shortcut that you can remember, and that's something is very useful. Okay, now let's say I want some gaps between the columns. So this is my grid. Let's turn it on. This is my grid. Okay, and I want column space. So it's kind of like I want some gap here. By default, the elements are designed to stretch, but I want some space. In order to add the space, you can use column gap, and you can use this column gap and write 10 pixel, 20 pixel, whatever you want. And here, the moment you do this, you will have this gap here. Similarly, for the rows, you have the row gap, and when you do this, you can use this gap. Now, a shorthand for this is simple gap, and here you can specify 10 pixel. It is automatically going to be applied on both rows and columns. If you want to adjust them, you simply have to use the second value which is used for the column. Okay, so this is column gap, the first one is for the row gap. So notice here you have the 4 pixel as column gap and 10 pixel as the row gap. So row gap is kind of this gap is kind of useful when you want some gaps. Okay, now that we have these fundamentals, let's talk about like something called the spanning of the element across the grid boxes. So let's say this is my first content and I want it to span it across the two columns. So I want it to span it from the line 1 to line 3. So notice here we have 3 lines, 1, 2 and 3, and we have 2 columns, 1 and 2. Now these 1, 2 and 3 are not the columns, they are the line numbers. Okay, and here if you see this, here it says -1. So this -1 simply means the last line. Now you can also uh, give them some names, but that's something I believe you won't need, and it's something that, like, it's totally up to you how you're going to name that thing and read about that thing. I'm not going to cover that part, but note that whatever I am going to teach you is more than sufficient in order to create any kind of grid layout. Okay, so here we have this first line, second line, and third line. Okay, what I want this first view to span from the first line to the third line. In order to do that, let's go to the first div. I'm not going on the grid item, I'm going on the first div itself. And here I'm saying, here I want this thing to go from 1 to the third. In order to do that, first of all, let's try to add a background color and let's give it red. Okay, so that we have a distinction here. And now I want this, there are various properties. As you can see, you have, like, various things. So let's go with this grid column start. So this is where you say that I want it to start at the line 1. Okay, and the second property is grids end. Okay, so here you want where this column should end. So here you should specify 1, 2, 3. Here you should specify 3 if you want that 3 to happen. Okay, so when you see say 3, it's going to go to that 3. Now let's say if you're very curious, you might wonder, like, what if I say 4? So the moment you say 4, it's going to create a new column for you, and it is going to do that, expand it to that column. So notice here a new column is automatically created for us. Now grid algorithm automatically creates a new column for you, and you can also adjust their width and height. Yeah, I'll talk about that very soon. Now there is shorthand for this, and I think shorthand is more useful, and you should always use this thing because it also gives you ability to kind of like put this content somewhere, in some location, specific location. So let's say you want this to exist in the second column. If you want to exist it in the second column, you simply have to specify the column number, and it is going to put that thing in that column. Okay, so when I say this 2, it's going to put that in the 2. And the first, notice here, the first one is kind of like, it's empty, and this is how it works. So if you, let's say if you say 3, it's going to put it in the 3, and rest of the things are kind of like, going to start from there and going to the next row, then next row, next row. Okay, so these two are kind of empty. I'll also talk about how we can make these things go away. Now, this is the column number you are specifying, not the line number. Here is specifying column number. Now let's say you want to another way of doing this thing is using the span. So when you say span, you have to specify to what column you want to span it to. That means to what column you want to span it to. So here is saying span to. This means, hey, I want this particular element to span it to the second column. So this is going to cover the entire second column, and the rest of the element that's after it are going to be laid out after this particular thing. Okay, so this is another way of writing it. Now, another way of doing this thing is simply writing in this way. So when you say 1 by 3, so you are simply saying, hey, start from line 1 and go to the line 3. Okay, and notice here, this is now about the lines. This is not about the specific column. So when we say span and when we say a specific number, we are saying that thing, okay, that column. But when you say 1 by 3, we are simply saying here, span it from line 1 to line 3. Okay, so this is how this grid column works. So this is a shorthand for this grid column start and grid column end. Okay. Similarly, you have grid row, and here also kind of like, you can specify here, I want it to span it to the second row. So right now, notice here it is spanning to the second row, but since the height is 38 pixels, it's not doing that. But if I comment that out, notice how this particular thing is spanning it to the second row as well. Okay, so it is going to the this last in the second column till end, and also in the second row it is taking the entire space, and rest of the things are kind of like placed after this thing. So this is how grid column and grid row work, and they are the properties available on the elements. So they are on the grid item, not on the grid container. So this is again something that you can use. So let's say you are creating header, footer, and sidebar. In that situation, you can do this thing. Okay, so you can span this first part to the entire this end, to the very end, and that is going to work as your header. And you can create another column that is going to work as your sidebar, and the last one that you see here, that can work as your footer, and this middle part that you see here, that can work as your main content. Okay, so this is how you can use your this grid layout in order to create all sorts of design that you expect from your project. So this is something that you have to understand, and this is really useful here because it's kind of like it gives you complete control over how you want things to uh, design. Okay, so now here, let's say I want it to go from the 2 to 3. Okay, now I want to show you something, that there are properties that's going to allow you to fix these parts. Let's say you do not want this this particular thing. So if you do not want that thing, in order to do that, let use this grid auto flow. Now what this grid auto flow is, so right now if you notice, if I disable this thing, all my elements are going from the first row to the second row, then it is going to the third row, then it's going to the fourth row, right? That means the elements are getting laid out starting from the row 1, then it is going to the this column direction, then it is going to the next row, then it's going to the next row. So this is kind of like default behavior here. So the grid auto flow determines the flow of the placement. So when you say row, you will not see any change here, but if you say column, notice you will see really like a different change. So right now everything is getting laid out in the column direction. That means the first element goes in first column, then it is going to second column, and is automatically creating new columns for you, and it's going there. Okay, so here notice there is no it's not really useful here. You'll have to kind of specify one FR for all of them. So it's kind of like like grid auto flow determines like in what direction you want these things to flow. But by default, row is more than sufficient for your use case. And I think this is something that you should stick to. Now, I was saying this grid column slash 2 3, so that means I want it to start from line 2 and end at line 3. Now here we are left with the blank space, and let's say I do not want this blank space. If you do not want the blank space, what you can do here, you can specify along with the row or column, you can specify something called dense. Okay, so the moment you do this dense, the blank space is automatically kind of filled. So notice this part was kind of like slightly moved above, and it fills this entire thing. Now, the idea here is to do not leave any blank space, uh, in before the contents. So this is the idea here. So if let's say you have n number of rows and n number of columns, in that situation, wherever the content is concentrated, in that area you will not see any kind of a blank space. That means if you're using column, you will not see any blank spaces. The area where the contents are available. Okay, so dense simply means hey, fill up the blank spaces. So this is the idea here. Okay. Now, that we have this thing, let's talk about the automatic columns that are created. So let's say I am spanning it from the line 2 to line, let's say line, let's say I am putting this in the column 5. So I'm putting it in the 5th column. Okay, so now notice here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th. Okay, so let's just for the sake of simplicity, let's make it third column. Okay, so this this thing is automatically getting placed in the third column, and third column is automatically getting created for us. Now the width of this third column is not 1 FR that we allocated here, right? So how we can actually make sure that the automatic columns that are automatically being created by the grid is kind of it has some width to it. Okay, so you want some width to that thing. Okay, in order to do that, you have to use grid auto column. Okay, and this property is kind of going to help you give you accessibility to that automatic columns, and then here you can specify the width that you want. So let's say you want it to have 1 FR similar to the these two columns that you created. So if you are saying here 1 FR, the automatic columns that are created for you, they will have 1 FR width. That means one fraction of the available space in the this container. So automatically the new columns that are created will have 1 FR. So here if I say, hey, I want this element to be placed in the 5th column. So 5th column is automatically kind of created, all the columns, and notice here all the columns are getting 1 FR, 1 FR. So all these automatic columns 1, 2, 3, they're getting 1 FR space. Okay, so this grid auto columns kind of helps you determine the width of that column. Okay, similarly you can control the height of these rows, and you have for that thing you have grid auto rows, and here also you can specify 1 FR. Okay, so the moment to do this, and here if you want this thing to span across, let's say six columns. So moment you do this, notice all the rows that are created, they have 1 FR height. Okay, so this is kind of how it works. So try to experiment with this thing, because only after you have experimented and tried out on your own, you will see that how these things works. So grid auto column, grid auto rows determine the width of the new columns and new rows that are automatically created. So this is all you have to remember. Okay, now let's close this thing and let's comment this thing out. Okay, now apart from this, there is something that I want to show you, and let me give you this thing. Okay, so let's say I want something else. Okay, so right now if you do this, notice it's automatically adjusting the 1 FR, 1 FR. Okay, but what if I specify some width to it? So let's say I want it to be 100 pixel. Okay, so the moment I do this, if I go here, okay, notice here on a very small screen, it's kind of we're getting a scroll bar. So that means in the x direction we are getting this grid is becoming because it has to take into account the width 100 pixels, right? So that means each column is now 100 pixels. So we have to kind of worry about that scroll bar on this body, right? So what if we want the grid to be automatically responsive? So in that situation, there is a solution for us. Okay. So let me show you what that means. So the moment here, what you can do, you can pass, okay, I want this to be autofill 100 pixel. Okay. So the moment you do this, notice each of the container is now 100 pixel. But here what happens is this autofill automatically, like, it makes your grid layout become responsive. So if you do this, notice how everything becomes responsive and we are not getting any scroll bar. So how this autofit works? So autofill and autofix. So there is something called autofit. Autofit works in a similar way, similar to this autofill. And notice how they are automatically making a grid layout very responsive. So I think really this is an useful feature that you can use if you want, if you do not want to deal with responsiveness. But they again, like, they have their own limitations in some cases, but still they are useful. Okay, they automatically make your grid layout very responsive. Now let me tell you the difference between autofill and autofit, how they work. So this autofill, so when I say 100 pixel, and let's also say this, let's make it 10 pixel. Okay, so this autofill, what this does, this creates, like, as many columns is as possible. Okay, so it's going to create 10 pixel columns, and it's going to use the entire container space, and it's going to create as many columns as possible. Okay, so here as you can see, this is the 60th line. That means we have around, like, 59 columns. Do your own calculation, but notice here, like, there are so many columns that are visible to us. Okay, and these are kind of, like, some things that are available to us, and when the new content comes in, those columns are automatically, kind of, like, you can say, they are automatically filled. So when you create a new div, this new div automatically that will occupy the next column, next column, next column, next column. So this is how it works. It's automatically going to fill up the next columns for you. Okay, and the auto fit thing, this is also going to create, like, the 59 columns. I believe 59. Okay, so it is also going to create the 59 columns, but notice the rest of the columns that are not occupied, they are kind of like collapsed here. That's why you see the 60 line number here, because those things are kind of like collapsed. They are not, like, available on the container itself. Okay, so when the new content comes in, then only the content, that particular content will get the new column, and then it will appear here, and rest of the things will again be collapsed. Okay, so the grid autofill, it creates as many columns as possible, and those columns are visually, like, you can actually check them out using this navigator in this this DOM. But if you're using autofill, those extra columns, those are created, but those are collapsed. Okay, and they are only used when needed. So this is kind of, like, something that you have to understand, that autofit and autofill help you, like, they help you create responsive grids. But at the same time, the slight difference here is that autofill creates empty columns and they are visible in autofill creates empty columns that are visible. In autofit, you do not see those columns because the extra columns are collapsed. So this is the difference here. So try to use this autofit or autofill if you think that those things are kind of, like, useful in your use case, and if you think they are going to make your grids responsive. Otherwise, you stick to, like, the basics. You do not even have to move into this more complex things. Now, apart from this, uh, you know, you also have something called grid template area. Okay, and now I'm not going to tell you what that thing is. So grid template area basically is, like, there you can specify a name to a specific, like, column and row. So you can specify, like, header, header, header. So you can say this, like, this is header, 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 this is body, this is body, this is body, this is body, this is body. Okay, and now in this, on the grid items, what you can do, you can place them at a specific name. So whatever name you selected for a specific area, so let's say you said this is the header, then on the grid item you can say, hey, I want this to have a grid area of header, and then you can, like, automatically that thing will be placed to that specific location. So this is similar to this grid column, but that's a different way of doing that. So do check that out, because That's something I do not use personally, and I think most of my use case is fundamentally covered in the concepts that I discussed here. Okay, so this is like this is all there to this is all you need to know about that thing. Now, apart from that, there is a concept of subgrid. Okay, so let's say this A is a div itself. Okay, now here I can use this display grid, right? I can do this as display grid. So the moment I do this, notice, in this browser, I have this display grid. Okay. Now the thing here is I can also use some columns here. Now I can use columns here, right? And, let me first span it. Let me first, let's do one thing. Let's span it to the 5. Okay. So let's do this. Now here I can I made this div as a grid, okay, in itself. Now this is going to work as a separate grid. Okay. And there is no guarantee that all the 10 rows and columns that we create inside this thing, they are not going to align with the parent one. So what if we need something that aligns with the parent one? So here if I use this grid template columns, let's say 10 pixel, 10 pixel, 10 pixel. Okay, so they are kind of they're here. But what if I want these things to align with the parent one? So if you want things to align well with the parent one, there is something called subgrid. And subgrid kind of it creates grid on top of the particular div, and automatically you will have this thing. So if I give some gap here, so let's say if I'm giving gap of 10 pixel. So when I'm giving a gap of 10 pixel, automatically notice this grid, this particular div is grid in itself. This grid is aligning well with the parent because the gap that we see, and this also automatically this particular grid is also getting that gap, and everything looks in that way. So notice here how it is aligning well with the parent because this gap is kind of compatible with this one. Okay. So subgrid is kind of something that you can use if you need it. So it's like you have the parent as a grid, and then you have an element inside the parent, and on that element you are creating another grid, but you want that grid to align well with the grid of the parent. So in that situation you can use this, make sure that you display that element as grid, and on the grid template columns you can use it as grid and a subgrid. Similarly for the row you can use grid template row subgrid. Okay, and this is really something you will be using, but still this is something you can keep in mind. Apart from this, I do not think there is more to the grids. Unless you practice it, it will not become clear, because I know this is whatever I taught you until now is really too much. And I don't think that these things will become clear until you start building projects and making concept, making things on your own. So all you have to understand that grids are useful when you want to create something that requires two-dimensional layout, and they give you ability to control the flow and the placement of the element on the screen in whatever manner you want. You can control their alignment, you can control their in height, width, justification, etc. You can even control the placement of the grid itself. You can decide the width of the container. You can determine the width of the columns, rows, etc. You can span the elements across rows and columns, and you can even determine the width of the automatically created columns and rows. And yeah, that is all there is to grid. And this is something that I believe can be useful in many situations. You can use it to create all sorts of layouts, and feel free to use it because it's kind of more complex than flex boxes, but I believe it's really amazing because one of the good thing about this thing is you can use this auto feed or autofill, and they automatically make your grid layout responsive. Instead of writing media queries, you won't have to worry about that thing. Okay, but they also have their limitations which you will come across when you start building something. Okay, so that is all there is to the grid. If you found this video helpful, if you found some value, please make sure to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and leave a comment below. Okay, I'll be posting more such videos, so stay tuned, and I hope you learned something. Have a nice day.